So we last left off here. We were in Photoshop. We created basically a box and we broke it up into quadrants with guides. And then we also had some shapes that we went ahead and built and turned into this cool kind of organic thing here in Illustrator. And what we need to do is we need to bring our Illustrator document over to Photoshop. And the thing is that Photoshop and Illustrator work really well hand in hand together, and there's all sorts of ways to do it. And what I want to show you now is just all the different ways, okay? And what you will probably learn is that as we go to build this color wheel, it's less about building a color wheel. It's there, don't get me wrong, we're going to build a color wheel, but it's also about a bunch of functions you might have forgot about, so it's a nice kind of review. And at the same time, it's going to teach you some new stuff, like this back and forth between the softwares. So first off, let's get rid of this other one. I don't need that anymore. I have this. This is really what I'm focused on, right? So I have this. I'll save it, right? Color wheel shape.ai. So how do I bring this into Photoshop? Well, I can go to Photoshop and I can say File and Open, and I can open up a AI in there. And it enables it as any readable document, and it formats it as what we call a Photoshop PDF. So when I open this up, let's look and see what happens. Okay, it comes in as a page, and what it wants to do is it wants to crop to the bounding box, and it wants to anti-alias it, which means it's going to rasterize it essentially. And even though it's a PDF, it's not going to stay a vector. And it wants to give us sizes, and it wants us to put in resolution, and I guess I can say okay. And what it does is it takes our vector, it turns it into a bitmap right here on the fly. It's not a vector anymore. These are pixels now. You know that because you can take an eraser and you can literally cut right through them. Sometimes that's what you do to get from Illustrator to Photoshop. It's a thing. It works. People do this every day. This is not what we're doing here, but this is one way in which you can go ahead and you can make this happen. And I'd like to just point out that what it does is essentially it does this rasterization, and whatever you have in Illustrator, if I had multiple layers, it wouldn't separate them into layers for me. It would just come in flat. So I just want to point that out to you. All right, next, let's go back to Illustrator, and let's take our document and let's do what's called exporting it. So we're going to go to File and Export, and we're going to say Export As. Export is just another word of save, and another way to say save. It's pushing it somewhere else. So I can export from Illustrator a bunch of different ways. I'm going to export using a Photoshop format, so a PSD. So I'm going to make it a native Photoshop document. So I'm going to rasterize it. So anyway, I'm going to say export, and here it gives me some options. So here it gives me CMYK as the color model because that's the one I was using. Even though the color model that I was using in Photoshop is RGB, I could still make this work. It allows me to pick a resolution, a screen, medium, or high. Always go with high. It allows me to either flatten my image or write layers. And if I have the ability to write layers, I'm always going to write layers. Always, always, always. And it allows me to anti-alias, and it wants to give me maximum editability, and it wants to embed the ICC profile. Again, all these are good things. Now, I'm not going to say okay yet because I want to prove something. I'm going to go to my layer palette, and this is literally just called layer 1, and I'm going to call it Nick's Funky Shape. Okay, and we're going to save that, and now we're going to export it one more time, and we're going to actually export it as a Photoshop document, and we're going to keep all this stuff here, all that stuff we just talked about. And we're going to come back to this window this semester. So if you don't quite get this, that's all right. And once you see that we have multiple layers, you're going to realize that this window could really be your friend. So anyway, I'm going to say okay to this. And it writes the Photoshop file. And then I come back to Photoshop, and I'm going to say File and Open. And check this out. I'm going to have the opportunity to click on my color wheel shape.psd, and I'm going to say open because it's a Photoshop document. And it gives me basically what it did for me before when it just kind of brought it in and converted it, except I controlled it a little bit more. Check it out, Nick's Funky Shape. That's the name of the layer. And if I had multiple layers here, it wouldn't flatten it automatically on me. It would allow me to bring over layers. So again, this is another way which we can take a vector and turn it into a bitmap. Although this is not what we're going to be doing for this assignment. Okay, so how about the concept of placing, right? Do you remember that from Graphics 1? Well, let's go ahead and let's look for place. So place is kind of like open, right? So let's see, we have new and we have open recent, close, save as, export, all these things, right? We don't have anything like that. We have import, but really that's not what we're looking for. And here's the thing. Here we are, place embedded or place linked. So let's go ahead and try this. And let's place an embedded shape, or place a linked shape. Remember in Illustrator, we picked it after there was only one place command. Again, I'll do the AI file, and it's going to ask me the same thing. And now it brings it into the document that I was working on, right? And it actually goes ahead and it modifies it in such a way where it creates its own layer, and it's called color wheel shape because it's what the file was called. That can work again to go from Illustrator to Photoshop, but it's just not what we're doing this time. It's not that it's wrong, it's just this not what we're doing now. Again, I'm going through all these things because I need you to realize that there's not only one way to drive to the mall. You can drive to the mall 17 different ways, and you need to know all of them, and then you pick which way is best as you go ahead and decide to drive to the mall when you feel like it. So as you decide to move between Photoshop and Illustrator and Photoshop, I just want you to be aware, and then you pick the best one when you're doing your projects. So, okay, so those are all the ways in which Photoshop opens or places or can get files from Illustrator through the general, file open commands. But what we can do also is we can select an object and we can say edit and copy. And we can come over here, not open bridge, sorry, but we can come over here to our Photoshop document and I can say edit and paste. And hey, I got options, 4 options. And you're like, oh man, stop with the options, just tell me the right one. Well, sorry. So let's do a smart object, okay? Now, what is a smart object? Essentially, it's kind of like a thing inside of a plastic baggie. So I'm going to say okay to this smart object. And what it does is it brings it over, and it's a vector. And it's cool because it allows me to scale this thing really small and itty bitty. So itty bitty, right? And then watch, I'm going to zoom into it. And it looks like garbage. Wow, why does it look like garbage? Because it's zoomed in 2,683%. That's why. Now, if I go ahead and I scale it the other way, it kind of looks like it could be problematic when I click off of it. Hey, it smooths right out. That's interesting. How did it do that? Why did it do that? Because it's a smart object, and what it's doing is it's reading the original vector. So that means I can make it as big as I want, as small as I want. I can go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it's not a problem. Now, I'd like to point something out on here that I guess I didn't notice before when I was working in Illustrator. And that is that, do you see how it's got kind of a black outline, but it's a different black? It's because I'm working with RGB black here in Photoshop, and I was working with CMYK black in Illustrator, and they're a little bit different. So check this out. Vector smart objects are editable. And what I mean by that is this. Let's go ahead and make it a little bit smaller. Okay, and I just did a quick Control T on a PC, Command T on a Mac. So watch this. I'm going to go click, click. And this window opens, and it says, after editing the contents, choose File Save to commit the changes. Those changes will be reflected upon returning to this file. Oh, okay, cool. So what it does is it comes to Illustrator, and it doesn't go back to my original saved image. It comes back to this other image, right? This other one right here. And watch, I'm going to select this, and I'm going to make a change that's going to be noticeable. I'm going to give it a green outline. That's it. Oh, that, and I'm also going to go ahead and, I don't know, how about let's have some fun, and let's take a knife and cut right through it. and separate those, okay? And I'm going to say, I like to close my Vector Smart object, so usually I just hit the close command, and here I'll say, yeah, save, sure. And now check this out. We're going to come back to Photoshop, and voila, it's got a green outline, and it just separated. See, it's going to update all the time, and smart objects are freaking smart, and that's awesome. It's an awesome, awesome thing. And the thing is that while this is great, we're not doing this right now. But now you know. Okay, so let's do that again. Copy. Actually, it's already copied. It's still in the ether out there. So if I go to edit and paste, pixels. Okay, let's do that. Okay. Now, when you go ahead and you paste this pixels, what it's going to do is it's going to go ahead and rasterize it. I've said that word a few times. What does that mean? That means that we go ahead and we change it from a vector, that math-based equation, nice, crisp, and clean shape, to something that's made out of pixels. That's what that means. And I'm going to go ahead and if I say okay, it will do that. Now, what if I want it to be smaller? Well, that's okay. I can make it smaller. Okay. What if I want it to be bigger? Also, I can make it bigger on the initial drop-in. Okay. It doesn't matter if I increase the size really big. As long as I haven't okayed the transformation yet, we'll be fine. When I okay the transformation and I zoom in 100%, still beautifully crisp graphics, right? Now, we also know, though, that if I were to go ahead and I made it and I brought it in, it was smaller, and then I went ahead and I tried to make it bigger, that extremely crisp graphic turns into something that's not quite crisp. And that's because they were pixels. And pixels are based on those little squares of color information. And when you go ahead and you push them and you pull them and you drag them and you modify them, it creates problems. So I want to just be clear, though, that sometimes bringing something in as a pixel is perfectly okay. It's just that's not what we're doing today. Let's paste again. So now we have two more. We have path and we have shape layer. Spoiler alert, we're going to use path. So I want to just teach shape layer first. So if I say okay to this, what it does is it brings it in as a vector. And it is currently hiding on you. You see it over here, but you do not see it on the screen. And here's why. Okay, I'm going to undo it for a second. You see how the foreground color is black? Well, when we bring over a shape layer, it just comes in as the foreground color. So if I flip-flop this and make it white, for example, and I paste this in with a Command or a Control-V and say okay, voila, you see it. Okay, and it works. It's great. You know, it's got a fill. It's got a stroke. Now we can select this object, right? And so I can go ahead and I can grab this object with the path selection tool here in Photoshop, and I can give it any color fill that I'd wish. I could also go ahead and come here on the layer palette and go click, click, and then I can pick any color here as well and say okay to that. Those all work. It's a vector, which means I can go ahead and I can make it really small, and then I can make it really big. And then when we go ahead and we zoom in to 100%, wow, look at that, nice and crisp. Now you might see this weird line on there. That's just the outline that Photoshop gives to vectors when you're working with them. If I click off onto the background layer, see how it's nice and you don't see that line anymore. It's nice and crisp. Now, I'd like to point out, when you work with vectors, okay, you can't use a bunch of tools. Like you can't use the eraser tool. Well, actually, I was on the background. Let's try that again. You can't use the eraser tool. You see the no smoking sign kind of thing? You can't use a paintbrush tool. You can't use the clone stamp tool. You can't use the healing brush. You can't use the paint bucket tool, okay? Because it's a vector. All you can do is you can edit it with the handful of vector tools that we have here. So we have things like the path selection tool or the direct selection tool. So I could edit this thing actually just like I could in Illustrator. I could edit it here in Photoshop if I wanted to. I could also go ahead and I could add anchor points to it if I felt the need, and I could go ahead and then modify them as well. But what I can't do, and I could also select an anchor point, and I can hit delete and delete that as well. What I can't do though is I can't just color it. I can't just apply pieces to it. How about selections? Could I make a selection of this? The answer is yeah, you can make a selection of everything because selections kind of like hover on it. But like, could I go ahead and could I use the paintbrush after that selection? No, and it's just because you're on this layer. Well, okay, could I do like a Command J and jump that piece up to that layer? No. Command J, when you have a selection, if you only want to copy part of it, that only works when you have pixels. So what it did instead was it duplicated the entire shape one copy. So again, shapes are a wonderful thing in Photoshop, and we're going to actually use them in this assignment. We're just not going to do it this way. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say edit and paste, and we're going to paste as a path and say OK. Now, when you learned Illustrator, you learned about shapes and you learned about paths. And paths are the lines, right? And shapes essentially are what gets filled in. So a path is also a vector. Okay? It's just not a filled in vector. So the thing about paths to point out though is that notice how there's no there's absolutely no like layer, right? So there's a window here. There's a palette in Photoshop called the Paths palette. And I'm going to open that up. And what the Paths palette is it allows me to go ahead and create layers from here. It allows me to go ahead and create selections from here. It's basically a really powerful tool that we're going to come back to multiple times this semester. So with my layer palette selected and my path palette selected, and I'm going to hide some of this other stuff we're not using, right? What I'm going to do is with this path highlighted, and the path layers the path palettes kind of like the layer palette. See, if I click off of it, it disappears, but if I click on it, it shows up again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to our layer palette, and we have all these different things here. We have this thing that kind of looks like a half moon cookie, and I'm going to say solid color. And what that's going to do is that is going to go ahead and create a layer for me. This is a way to create a shape layer. And I could just say okay to that. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is I can come over here on my path palette and I can go ahead and say, create a new path with foreground color. Now, that's cool, but what that does is that just goes ahead and it puts it on the background layer. That's not what we want. Visually, yes, it looks the same, but it's not exactly what we're hoping for here. Instead of using both of those things, I want to teach you this other skill. With the path highlighted, okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say edit, and I'm going to say define custom shape. And what we're going to do is we're going to save a custom shape into Photoshop. So I'm going to call it Nick's Funky Shape and say OK. And here's the thing. I'm going to click off the work path, and I could actually select the work path and I could hit delete because I don't need it anymore. But for now, I'm just going to click off of it. That way it's just kind of hanging out there in case I do need to fall back to it, although I don't think I'm going to. And we're gonna stop there, but before I do, I just want to show you where the shape ended up. If you come over here to Photoshop, we have shapes. We have rectangles and rounded rectangles and ellipses and polygons. So it's really like Illustrator. Then we have this other thing with like it kind of looks like a little amoeba or the AOL guy called the custom shape tool, right? And Photoshop has all these shapes built into it, like arrows and lightning bolts and fleur-de-lis, and what's that last one? That's my shape. See, Nick's funky shape. And we're going to come back and we're going to use Nick's funky shape and begin to make our color wheel. Thank you.